I welcome you all. I welcome you all to this webinar on spine. After this COVID epidemic, we are regularly cutting the webinar. And last webinar, we had Dr. Prakash as a guest speaker and very excellent talk. Today, we have the spine webinar. We have the eminent speakers. It was Rajamani, it was Andy Uraj, and Dr. Uraj Murugan, and panelists for this session. In 12 orthopedics today, unfortunately, last week we lost one young, energetic 12 orthopedic society member, Dr. Shivasaran. Unfortunately, he was our student. He finished his MBBS from Raja Muslim Medical College. He finished his MS also from Balaji Medical College. And then, after finishing his senior residency at Vinaya Mission, he joined with us as assistant professor 2 years before. He was a young ortho surgeon and a pharmacy surgeon. And unfortunately, last week, when he returned from his practice to avoid a crowd, he had a skid and then he met with a fatal accident. So, on behalf of Orthopedic Society, we convey his condolences, and as a mark of respect, I request all members to have a 1 minute of silence.
So, Neelakrishnan sir, okay. Natarajan sir, I will introduce and then we'll go per se. Good evening, each and every single attendees, panelists, my teachers, my mentors. So, as such, today's topic is on the spine, and the first topic will be handled by Dr. Yuvraj. He will be talking about myelopathy, how to diagnose and how to treat. And to talk about Yuvraj, Yuvraj is a good friend of mine, and we worked for almost 4 years together in PIMS Medical College. He is a great spine surgeon, I would say, because I have personally seen him operating. He did his MS Ortho from Madras Medical College, and then he went to CMC to do his 2 years of spine fellowship, and he had some finished fellowships in US. And I welcome Dr. Yuvraj to present on myelopathy. Over to you, Yuvraj.
Thank you, Dr. Ram. Thank you for the kind introduction. So let me start by thanking the Solometal Ortho Society and Sanofi for organizing this great webinar here. So can I start off with the talk now, if it's okay?
Yes. Yeah, you can start.
Yes, sir. Yeah. So I'll just start sharing my screen now.
Yeah. So yeah, there will be 3 topics today. Each presenter will be talking about 15 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll start off with the first talk. We'll start off the session today with the first talk on approach to cervical myelopathy. So this is going to be the outline of my talk. I'll start with the natural history, then go on to clinical evaluation, imaging, treatment, and surgical strategies, and then I'll finish up by a summary. The cervical myelopathy, we all know, is a constellation of signs and symptoms arising from compression of the cervical spinal cord itself. And the misdiagnosis is very common because of the subtle nature of symptoms in the early stage of the disease. Okay, so natural history. So 75% of patients, they deteriorate in a stepwise fashion. So this is quite interesting because they are normal for a period of time. They develop worsening in function and they drop like this. And then they stay like this. They plateau off for quite a period of time again. And again, they drop off like this. So it doesn't mean that somebody who's had a progression of symptoms and somebody who's not showing any symptom progression for a short period of time doesn't mean that the disease is static, because the nature of the disease is most of the times it goes in a stepwise worsening. And some people, 20% show slow and steady worsening, and 5% develop rapid worsening of symptoms. And conservative treatment can be tried only in early stages with only mild symptoms, and even these patients have to put on close follow-up. So I'll just talk a little bit on history and examination. So what can you expect to see in on history in these patients? So most of the symptoms can be easily attributed to normal aging phenomenon in elderly patients. And upper extremity symptoms are commonly seen as triceps weakness and clumsiness and hand functions. These are the 2 most important findings you see in cervical compressive myelopathy: triceps weakness and hand function clumsiness. And they may present as with symptoms like dropping objects, inability to hold coins, inability to button shirts, etc. And they can also have diffuse non-dermatomal weakness or lower extremity proximal muscle weakness up to a mild variety. And lower extremity, the symptoms are usually gait related. So they have gait instability or a sense to fall. And the relatives may say that he's walking like a drunken person. And on neck movements, these patients may present with electric shock-like sensations going through the entire body because of worsening cord compression or usually on neck extension like this. And urinary urgency may be seen in advanced stages. So what is usually not seen? This is quite important because you have to recognize that neck pain is usually not a common symptom in all cases of cervical myelopathy. Also, radicular symptoms may not be there. So these patients may not come to you saying, I have pain along this one dermatome or one side upper limb. They have more diffuse symptoms. And frank motor weakness is usually absent until the disease is advanced. Also, frank ball blood incontinence are usually absent until disease is advanced to a greater extent. So they usually come with very subtle signs of the numbness and clumsiness, etc. On examination, we may find that in early disease, the neurological examination may be completely normal. So this is something that has to be borne in mind. So just do a superficial examination, we find that motor sensory is normal, doesn't rule out the possibility of existing myelopathy. And weakness may be the only motor deficit in these patients. So always put a little more importance on and grip examination and to see the atrophy and intrinsics. So always perform a complete sensory examination. So dorsal valve involvement usually means that the disease is in advanced stages, and bowel blood involvement, if it has occurred, means that the disease is advanced and the prognosis is quite poor. So provocative tests, so these are all usually tests that can be used to bring about the UMN signs. So Lermit sign can bring about electric shock-like sensations on cord compression. So positive Babinski sign, sustained clonus, Hoffman sign, inverted radial reflex. These are all upper motor neuron symptoms. And scapulohumeral reflex is something that can be seen in IS cervical cord compression, let's say C2 or C3 compression. So here, when you tap on the lateral angle of the scapula, the patient may get a jerk up in the shoulder. And jaw jerk test is something that is to be borne in mind. So these UMN signs, that is clumsiness or upper motor neuron symptoms, they're not exclusive only to cervical cord compression. They can be seen even in cortical, cervical or cortical or motor cortex involvement. So in these patients, doing a jaw jerk test, that is tapping out the angle of the mentum here, can lead to opening of the mouth. So if the jaw jerk test is present, that usually indicates that the pathology is intracranial in the brain and not in the cervical cord. Okay, so assessment test or Romberg test is used and grip and release test. So that is the ability to make and unclench a fist. So normally you should be able to do at least 20 fists in a span of 10 seconds. Finger escape sign. So on holding the hand out like this, the little finger tends to drift out in a myelopathy. So time gait, tandem gait, triangle step test is a newly described modality. All of these are used to assess the myelopathy in these patients. So etiology, so commonest cause is cervical spondylosis, that is degenerative cervical disease. Congenital narrow canal can lead on to early onset of symptoms, and OPLL is something that's common in Asian population. The other, like tumor epidural lapses, they are not classical cause of cervical myelopathy. And DD, so any patient who presents with these motor or clumsy and fine function weakness can be having maybe because of a stroke, or can be because of movement disorders or Parkinsonism, or it can be a transverse myelitis or multiple sclerosis. So all of these can be easily ruled out on doing a thorough clinical examination. And even if that is confusing, an MRI will tell you the diagnosis. So clinical examination, usually I would say 90% of the times, just on thorough clinical examination, you will be able to say whether it's myelopathy in the cervical cord or something coming from the intracranial region. So imaging. So the most important imaging, as always, is a plain X-ray for us, and lateral cervical spine X-ray is the most important thing. So I would say it will demonstrate the alignment and also the canal narrowing. Alignment can be seen by a C2 to C7 Cobb angle, and the canal narrowing can be made out by using Cobb-Pavlov ratio. That's nothing but the ratio between the canal diameter and the vertebral body. The ratio of less than 0.8 means that the canal is stenotic, probably congenital stenosis. And a flexion extension X-ray will demonstrate any underlying subclinical instability on this disease. Another important way of diagnosing a cervical alignment is to use a C2 to C7 sagittal vertical axis. There's nothing but dropping a plumb line from the center of the C2 vertebral body. So drop a straight plumb line down and measure the distance of this line from the posterior superior corner of C7. So if this distance is more than 35 to 40 mm, that is 3.5 to 4 centimeters, it means that the net alignment of the cervical spine is in kyphosis, and these patients usually do not do well after posterior decompression. So you can either use cervical C2 to C7 COP or a C2 to C7 SVA, that's the sagittal vertical axis. So avoid posterior surgeries and displaced SVA. A CT will help us in diagnosing OPLL or in presence of osteophytes. It will give us a clear picture of where the compression actually is. So OPLL can be of 4 types. So continuous segmental mixed or circumscribed to one region. So of these, continuous OPLL has the highest potential for compression and progression of symptoms. And patients with OPLL on anterior decompression, they are at increased risk of dural tears and CSF leak. So how to prognosticate this before the surgery? We can use this by seeing the appearance of the OPLL. So if it's a single layer, that is, it's continuous with the vertebral body like this, the chance of dural leak is probably the second most. The first highest risk is with a double layer sign. So in which you see a slight shadow that is adjacent to the vertebral body, and then there's the clear zone followed by another dural ossification. So this second layer is the dural ossification. So these people have an higher risk of dural tear and CSF leak. Third one is a C sign, in which the OPLL is growing into the dura and the dura is wrapped around here in the clear signs on both sides. So that carries a lesser risk of CSF leak. On MRI, seeing a circumferential cord compression, that is both anterior in the sides and posterior, this carries the highest risk of symptom exacerbation, and a low signal or hypointensity on T1 image has a poor prognosis of recovery even after surgery. So dynamic MRI is something that's coming up now to bring about subtle cord compression that is not seen on regular static MRI. So how do you grade these people before surgery? So you always need a way to set a baseline or functional baseline. So the most commonly used thing is Nurek grade. So we have grades from 0 to 5 based on the patient's ability to independently ambulate. So this is very simple to do off. You don't have to remember many points. You don't have to write or add up or divide or subtract a score. So you just can, based on the patient's ambulatory mobility, you give him a Nurek grade. So the higher the grade is, the lesser the prognosis for recovery easily. Another thing is an MJOE, that is the Modified Japanese Orthopedic Association score for the cervical spine. It takes into account motor dysfunction of the upper extremity, of the lower extremity, sensory dysfunction of the upper extremities, and sphincter dysfunction. So 18 is the maximum possible score. So anything, so you can have a baseline score, and after surgery or after treatment, you can see how the patient is progressing. So conservative treatment. So the role of conservative treatment in cervical myelopathy is not a very established one. So there's no high quality evidence on which people do well with conservative treatment. So based on the surgeon's preference and based on the disease severity, if the patient has very mild disease, you can probably start them on just follow up. You can put them on neck collars. You can start them on numbness paresthesia pharmacology treatment like pregabalin or gabapentin. You can teach them to avoid falls and start them on physiotherapy. But all these patients should be kept on close follow because they may suddenly deteriorate. Like they can show a stepwise progression. So if they deteriorate, they should deteriorate very sharply, very fast. Avoid conservative treatment in people who show progression of symptoms or people who have symptoms for more than 6 months and people who have a top Pavlov ratio of less than 0.4 on X-ray or CT and where the transverse area for cord is less than 40 mm. So avoid conservative all these people. So surgical. So surgery is usually the mainstay of disease once you're diagnosed with cervical myelopathy, and the debate is usually in what surgery to do in these patients: anterior, posterior, combined anterior, posterior. So this decision is usually based on the amount of stenosis, number of stenotic levels, the alignment of the spine, kyphosis or straight or lordosis, patient factors like presence of neck pain, comorbidities, or desire to prevent or limit motion. So cervical alignment is usually the first thing that we take into consideration when we decide on surgery to decide the approach. So somebody who has cervical kyphosis, that is the C2 to C7 cob is less than 0, or the C2 to C7 SVA is more than 4 centimeters, anterior approach is preferable. Somebody who has lordotic spine, so standalone posterior gives good decompression. So if there is a straight alignment, you can either go for anterior or posterior depending on the individual patient and your own preference. So this is just an overview of the normal alignments that you see on plain X-ray. So first is lordosis, where you see a nice lordotic curvature, or it can be a straight spine, or you can have an S-shaped spine. So in which one vertebral body is in front, other is behind, or a reverse S-shape, that is a reverse sigmoid, or you can have a frank kyphotic alignment. So all these are non-lordotic alignments, and lordosis is when you have a straight smooth curve present on the lateral view. So intrinsic stability. So patients who have over old age, they tend to have a lot of facet arthrosis and degeneration, and their spine mobility is naturally restricted. So these people have an intrinsically stable spine, and these people do well with just a laminectomy because the spine is already stable. And consider adding fusion if you find any instability on flexion or extension. So younger patients who have congenital stenosis, these people have multiple level compression, but there is no disc osteophyte or anything like that. And these patients also do well with this laminectomy or laminoplasty. So anterior versus posterior. So I'll just start off talking about anterior approach. Advantages of anterior approach is that most of the times the compression in cervical myelopathy is coming from anterior elements. It's either from the disc or from the OPLL or from an osteophyte. So anterior approach can directly address this compression. It is muscle sparing, has minimal post-op neck pain, and the risk of infection is very less because it is muscle sparing. And it can decompress the anterior structures directly, and it can also correct the cervical kyphosis directly. Disadvantages is this is not suited for disease that is involving more than 3 levels, because you do more than 3-level anterior decompression, the complications of the approach are higher, like post-op dysphagia or post-op repentinal palsy causing hoarseness, against segment degeneration are all higher there. And if you also, there can also be problems with fusion when the approach is involving more than 3 levels. So what are the possible surgeries in anterior approach? The commonest that we do is a single level ACDF that's used for a single level disease. And if there are diseases of multiple levels, let's say there are 2 or 3 levels of compression anterior, you can either do a multiple level ACDF, but this has a lot of the union surfaces are more. So 1 ACDF means there are 2 union surfaces. If you do 3 ACDF, there are 6 union surfaces. So the chances of non-union are higher here. So to reduce this, you can do a corpectomy. So if you do a corpectomy, the union surface again becomes 2. So the union chances are improved, but the graft that you keep there can fail. That's a possibility. And another option is if you're doing multiple level anterior decompressions, you can add on to give a posterior instrumentation to give extra stability to the spine to reduce graft related complications. So anterior approach is indicated in kyphotic spine and a disease that is less than or equal to 3 levels. These are the classical indications, and you can always combine anterior with posterior instrumentation if there is combined posterior compression also. Okay. So this is a 2-level disc prolapse causing cervical myelopathy here, and we have done a 2-level ACDF using standalone cages. And yeah, this is a large disc prolapse spanning up to almost 2 vertebral bodies here and causing compression. So we opted to do a single level corpectomy here instead of doing a 2-level ACDF for ease of decompression, and we have placed a tricortical iliac graft and a plate. So coming to posterior approach, advantages is the approach is very familiar to most surgeons. It does not involve any tricky tissue corridors. It's quick to perform in multiple level disease, and a laminoplasty or a laminectomy without fusion, it is relatively motion preserving because we're not fusing anything. Whereas in anterior surgery, we almost always end up fusing it. And it's useful in short neck people where anterior is difficult, and somebody who's had previous anterior surgery, a posterior surgery is always preferable. The problems or disadvantages, you cannot do it in kyphotic spine because the cord does not translate back and decompression is not achieved. A C5 root palsy, post-op C5 root palsy is common in posterior approach. It can exacerbate subclinical subluxations, it can increase post-op neck pain, increase the muscle fibrosis or infection risk are there. So multiple procedures are possible in posterior approach. First is a standalone laminectomy. This is a classical surgery that most of us do in multi-level disease. But the problems of post-op kyphosis or post-op instability is there. So when can you do a standalone laminectomy? You can do it in a lordotic cervical spine with no instability. This is very important. And multiple level disease or multiple level OPLL in all these areas, when there is no instability, you can just do a standalone laminectomy and leave it alone. And only the patient should also not be having any significant neck pain for this. So this is a patient who has had, I think, a 3-level compression both anterior posterior and the lordotic spine. So we opted to do just a standalone laminectomy without any instrumentation. And laminectomy with fusion, this is done when there is instability or when there is significant neck pain, or also in patients who seem to have kyphosis on plain X-ray, but on extension views, you see that the kyphosis is correcting back to lordosis. That's a flexible kyphosis. So all these patients, you can get lordosis back by adding the instrumentation and putting those contoured rods. So when you have multiple level disease with instability or patient with axial neck pain, you always end up using these patients to get relief from neck pain. So because of implants, there are chances of implant failure or infections or misplaced screws, etc. So there's an example of multiple level for the compression here with the flexible kyphosis there. You see that we have done an decompression and lateral mass fixation. Sorry. So this again is another example of a multiple oval here. We've done a laminectomy. You can get back an alignment on extension, so you can always go ahead and do this. So laminoplasty. So in laminoplasty, yeah. So this preserves lateral biomechanics to some extent because the posterior tension band, the spinous process, and the supraspinous ligament are not removed in this. But the cord decompression is less extensive in this. So it can either be an open door approach or a double door approach. Indication for this laminoplasty is similar to a laminectomy without fusion. So lordotic spine without instability or a multiple level disease OPLL, you can do laminoplasty, but bear in mind that laminoplasty done in presence of pre-op neck pain gives very bad results because neck pain never subsides for this patient. So it's contraindicated when there is post-pre-op neck pain.
Yuvraj,
Yeah,
sorry
so this is an example.
Yuvraj, can you hear me?
Sorry to, yes, Ram, I can hear you.
Ram. Yeah. Quick because we are running out of time. We have crossed most.
Okay, sure. I'll just give me 2 minutes. I'll be done. Yeah. Okay. So this is an example of laminoplasty. I'll just skip through this. And combine anterior posterior. When you have multiple level disease with kyphosis, you can do an anterior decompression, correct the kyphosis into lordosis, and you can add posterior instrumentations to gain more stability. So this is just a summary of the how to choose an approach. So alignment is the most important thing that you're thinking of when you're choosing this. So I'll start with kyphosis here. If you see kyphotic spine, that is a rigid kyphosis, go for anterior always. You can always add posterior if you're doing multiple surgeries. A straight alignment, you can either go for anterior with posterior, or you can just do a laminectomy along with fusion. This is important. You cannot just do standalone laminectomy or laminoplasty here. So when you have lordosis, that's when you have more options. So if there's a posterior alone compression, you can do laminectomy, laminoplasty, provided there is no instability, or you can do a laminectomy fusion if there is instability. And if the lordosis with anterior compression, more than 3 levels, you can go for posterior surgeries. Less than 3 levels, you can go for anterior surgeries. That's where you have choices. But in straight or kyphotic spine, your choices are quite limited. So this is again a summary of what I've told till now, just a table of the same thing here. So I'll just summarize now since we're running out of time. So cervical myelopathy usually has a stepwise progression in natural history, and clumsiness of hand functions and gait alteration are the commonest presentations. Lateral radiograph is a must to evaluate alignment and instability. And CT and MRI help to plan surgery. Conservative treatment is only in carefully selected patients with close follow-up. Surgery is a primary treatment modality. Anterior approach is done in kyphotic spine with disease of less than or equal to 3 levels. Posterior approach in lordotic spine without instability or no neck pain. You can do standalone laminectomy or laminoplasty. But lordotic spine with instability or with neck pain or flexible kyphosis, you can do laminectomy fusion and combine approach in multiple level disease with kyphosis. So those are my references, and that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Yuvraj. That was an elaborate discussion about all myelopathy, cervical myelopathy. And is there any questions from attendees? So
you can see the chat box.
No questions.
Yuvraj, can I ask a question to you?
Sir, sure, sir. Please, sir. Please.
Yeah. Say in cases of multiple non-contiguous levels.
Yes, sir.
Suppose it's going to be 3 levels.
Yes, sir.
How will you approach it?
It's non-contiguous levels. I think first and foremost thing is always to look at the alignment of the spine, sir. So if the spine is in kyphotic alignment to begin with, I think we are forced to go anterior because a posterior approach is not going to help us in any way. If it is a lordotic spine, then if it is within C3 to C7, probably you can choose to do a laminectomy or a laminoplasty. So laminoplasty, again, as I said, should be avoided when there is neck pain. So I think the foremost thing to look at is alignment first, and also the symptoms, the presence of neck pain or instability on an flexion extension X-ray. So that will dictate whether the spine has to be fused or you can just do an laminectomy or laminoplasty.
Okay.
Yuvraj, one more question. A simple question. These patients present to us very late, these myelopathy patients. How can we give, we have to explain the patient the prognosis. How can we decide the prognosis depending upon the condition? We have to say the patient, we have to convince the patient, if you go well, if you undergo surgery, results will be good. How can we predict the prognosis?
Okay, so that's when these functional scores come into place, the Nuric grade or the MJOA score. So if somebody is say Nuric 3, so Nuric 3 is when there is gait problem and that is preventing them from going to normal work, but they are independently ambulant. So these patients, we can always, so the way that I personally convince what I have learned from my teachers is that we tell them that the surgery is to prevent further worsening. So we never tell them that this is to get you better or to get you normal, because that cannot be guaranteed in case of myelopathy. So I always tell them that there is scope for you to become worse than this, and the surgery is done to prevent you from getting bedridden or wheelchair bound. So somebody who's ambulant will always be open to that. So they can understand that that concept, and they will probably get in okay for the surgery. But somebody who's already wheelchair bound or somebody who's already Nuric 5, the surgery is done just to give them a chance. So probably if the Nuric, the worsening has happened very recently. So let's say just a 10-day or 15-day history of an inability to walk, you can probably tell them that there's a chance that you may be able to get your function back. So that's based on the scores, sir. So let's say there's, you do an MJOS score, the maximum possible score is 18. Somebody who has very low score, I think less than 7, I guess, is the cutoff. So for a good prognosis, you can always go take a call based on that. No, but I personally tell them this when I always tell them that surgery is to make them from getting worse.
Can I add on this?
Sure, sir.
Can I?
Yeah, please, sir.
Sir, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that is, of course, basically the prognosis is different from disc with spondylotic myelopathy and OPLL myelopathy. Apart from the score, another guidelines will be the myelomyelonic changes in the MRI. If there is a gross myelomyelonic changes, the probably, as the speaker said, you can't expect any recovery, but avoid worsening. Avoid worsening of the further disease that can be done. That is one. And in OPLL, doing with the lordosis, of course, is the main criteria to whether to go anterior or posterior. But we have done a series, and then I have published a paper almost now going to be more than 10 years ago. We had done laminoplasty and laminectomy. The recurrence rate following anterior surgery is lesser than posterior, number one. And number two, if you are going to do only a laminoplasty or laminectomy, the chances of C5, C6 neuropraxia will be there for 5 to 6 months, because you are releasing the cord from the posterior side. The cervical cord is fixed transversely, the C5C root is fixed transversely, the cord is fixed. So as and when you release posterior, the cord is entirely pushed backwards. So likely to get a C5, C6 neuropraxia, which might be there after surgery, and then we must inform the patient. So apart from clinical functional disability, you have to look into the changes in the spinal cord in the MRI, which will give you a clue. If there is an edema, probably patient will recover, but you can't expect a full recovery. Patient can be ambulant, but it can avoid further worsening.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you, sir.
So that's quite very true.
Some
What you said.
questions.
So like I said, having an T1 hypo intensity on the MRI is something that is said to carry the worst prognosis even after surgery. So you can have a T2 hyperintensity plus a T1 hypo intensity. It said that those patients do not usually recover well even after surgery.
So some questions in the chat box, which I want to put it to the speaker. So the first question is, how far you expect the sensory and the posterior column symptoms to improve after surgery, especially the posterior column. The patients might be better increasing in the power, but they will have a sway. So do you expect it to improve? That's one question. And if treated conservatively, what is the apt physiotherapy and medical management?
So, okay. So posterior column sensation, like I said, once somebody has started exhibiting posterior column symptoms, the prognosis for recovery is quite low. So that's what is said in literature. So what I've seen also is that usually the lower limb clumsiness or gait pattern may improve, but what doesn't improve is that sensation of paresthesia or imbalance. The proprioception or vibratory perceptions, and also hand grip. Hand grip is also the one that improves the last. So even after surgery. That's one thing. So physiotherapy conservative. So I would not say that I have a lot of experience in treating these patients conservatively. So most of the time we tell them that you'll do better with surgery. and they don't choose surgery, and they usually don't come back to you for further follow-up and all that. They usually go around seeing other people. So if at all you have to start somebody on conservative treatment, I would usually give them a collar just to prevent any aggressive falls or to prevent them from developing spinal cord injury. And also you can probably start them on sort of IFT neck or neck extension exercise, etc. But I don't know. There's actually no evidence on what physiotherapy is to be done or whether it has any role. I'm not able to. Nobody has actually proven the role of conservative in these people. Almost always you advise them to undergo surgery just because we don't want them to worsen. Because worsening, when it happens very fast.
May I add upon?
Sir, please, sir. Please, sir.
Yeah, you see, usually these types of myelopathy sensory system is the last one to be involved. The first is a motor weakness or motor spasm, in fact, and then gait disturbances. And the last one to be affected is the sensation. If the sensation is involved, probably the prognosis is poor. You are not going to have a good recovery. So sensation is the late manifestation in these types of compressive myelopathies. And another point is for conservative line of treatment, once the cord is compressed, it is a mechanical. It is not like a disc where you can give a conservative line of treatment, patient will improve. But these types of myelopathies are always progressive because the mechanical compression is going to always progress. Either it's OPLL or cervical cord myelopathy. This is always going to progress further. So I feel personally, if the changes are there and they obviously cannot get so much of narrowed, more than 60%, there is no role of conservative therapy.
Yeah, cervical myopathy is one indication where there is be operated for sure. That's a good answer to that. So just for the discussion to the panelist, the role of a dynamic MRI in cervical myopathy. Rajamani sir.
Dynamic MRI in cervical myelopathy.
Yes, yes.
Dynamic X-ray.
Yeah. You are actually dynamic role of MRI in dynamic is it may be useful in the where there is a doubtful disc where you can go for flexion and extension and canal stenosis, where there is an obviously pain is more. There is in old say they call it a concealed disc of Dandy. In those situations, a dynamic MRI will be helpful because when you flex and then disc will come posterior, when you extend, probably the ligamentum flavum will come in and then you will get the picture. But flexion and extension, the dynamic film, dynamic MRI do not show much changes in these types of myelopathies, especially OPLL and spondylotic myelopathies. Those will be useful in soft disc, and the myelopathy is due to soft tissue causes, something like a disc in the front and the ligamentum flavum on the posterior. Once there is a mechanical problem, usually this dynamic MRIs do not help much.
So add on to what sir said, if I may. So, Ram, hello?
Yeah, I just want to add up something. We did a study of, actually we are doing routinely a dynamic MRI for all cervical myelopathy. And for us, it made some decision change actually. For example, we would have done a static MRI. The patient would have something like a 4, 5 and 5, 6 spondylotic osteophytic cord compression myelopathy with the myelomalacia at one level. When we do an extension, usually when we do an extension MRI, the cord compression would be much more seen at the other level also. So the change of with the static MRI would have done only a 2-level ACDF. It would have become a posterior approach, especially to prevent an adjacent segment degeneration. So that's how we found gross differences. Yeah. So that's my point to add up there. And Yuvraj, you want to add up anything? Or
And I think that's sort of what I wanted to say. So dynamic MRI is when you are not sure what you want to do, or sometimes the MRI picture that you see and clinical picture that you see may not actually correspond. So because the compression may not be a static compression and the static MRI may not give you the diagnosis. So sometimes like you said, Ram, so it may change your surgical approach. Sometimes you may not be convinced by your static MRI whether it's compression or not. So those times dynamic MRI will actually bring out. I will tell you whether it's ongoing compression on certain neck position.
Yeah, one particular condition, Hirayama disease, we can definitely
Yeah.
the condition. Okay. So next to talk, I request Natarajan sir.
Yes.
Yeah, sir.
I am very happy to introduce my teacher, Professor Nalli Ramanathan Yuvraj, to speak on junctional tuberculosis of spine. He is the only he is the only professor who has started the spine unit in Madras Medical College, and now he is heading the professor of orthopedic spine surgery, ortho spine surgery unit in the Institute of Orthopedics and Traumatology in Madras Medical College and Rajiv Gandhi Government General Hospital. He was very much instrumental in starting this spine unit. He graduated his MBBS from Madras Medical College. He did his diploma in Kirpak Medical College and MS Ortho from Kirpak Medical College. And he is working in Madras Medical College for a long time. And he started this spine unit, and now he is heading as a professor of orthopedics. Sir, I invite you to talk on junctional tuberculosis of spine. Welcome, sir. On behalf of Cholamandalam Ortho Society, we are very happy to have you as our webinar speaker for this talk. Over to Dr. Nalli Yuvaraj, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Natarajan, for the nice words. And I'm extremely happy to be a part of the Cholamandalam Ortho Club webinar. And let me start with the lecture now. So literature on junction tuberculosis spine is scarce and the treatment protocol is ill-defined. Now, today I'm going to talk about junction tuberculosis, which is going to encompass the upper cervical tuberculosis, cervical thoracic tuberculosis, and lumbosacral tuberculosis. I purposely left the thoracolumbar tuberculosis because there is not much of a uniqueness in the management of thoracolumbar tuberculosis. It's the same as what we do for thoracic as well as the lumbar spines, whereas the other three have certain peculiarities which we need to know in the management of these problems. And here you see the incidence there. And the junction tuberculosis management is challenging on the following aspects. It has got a complex anatomy, unique biomechanics, unfamiliarity of the anatomy as well as the treatment protocol, and the surgical challenges associated with the management of these cases. Now, starting with upper cervical tuberculosis, the incidence is around 0.3 to 1% of spinal tuberculosis. Apart from the complex anatomy, the upper cervical spine, which is closer to the major neural structures as well as the vertebral artery, and the incidence of anomalies in this region, surgeries are most often difficult and risky. And sometimes intraoperative surgery could easily lead to vertebral artery injury or even respiratory failure and sudden death. Now, apart from the other features of a tuberculosis spine, the peculiar clinical presentation in atlantoaxial tuberculosis are the inability to hold the head. Sometimes it can present respiratory distress and with torticollis. Now, retropharyngeal abscess is one of the commonest mode of presentation, and it can present with dysphagia, dyspnea, or feeling of foreign body in the pharynx. Now, both rotatory dislocation as well as unequal collapse of the lateral masses can result in torticollis. And this is one of the features of this disorder. Atlantoaxial tuberculosis is more likely to combine with neurological damage as compared to spinal tuberculosis at other sites. The neurologic deficit may be due to the compression by the granulation tissue or the abscess, or due to atlantoaxial dislocation or due to vertical translocation of dens. Acute instability can result in catastrophic neurological deterioration and respiratory failure. Now, obtaining tissue from the upper cervical spine is quite difficult. But the transoral biopsy or aspiration of the abscess can be one of the modes of obtaining tissue for histopathology and for obtaining culture and antibody sensitivity testing. Now, the treatment of upper cervical tuberculosis has evolved over the years from the traditional methods like plaster immobilization, halo device fixation, and other conservative methods to the recent methods like development of internal fixation devices and spinal surgical techniques. This has been enabled by the better understanding of the atlantoaxial region anatomy, and with the advent of vertebral artery angiography, three-dimensional CT reconstruction, and high field strength magnetic resonance imaging. Now, coming to surgical management, the aims of surgery are to provide adequate debridement, decompression, and most importantly, reconstruction of the upper cervical spine stability. The anatomical structure around the atlantoaxial joint is complex, and the position of the vertebral artery is deep, which increases the difficulty of the operation and is challenging for the surgeon to develop surgical strategies. Now, the LIFISO has provided us with a classification which has helped us in the framing the guidelines in the management of these disorders. They have divided into 3 stages. Stage 1 is where it is characterized by infectious synovitis of the atlantoaxial or the atlantodental joint. Hence, there is no instability or structural damage to the bone, and these can be managed conservatively. This is one example of a 32-year-old man, stage 1 disease, where you just see involvement of the Atlantic axis joint alone, and there is no instability, but it present just with a sensory blunting. This was managed conservatively with good results. Now, stage 2 is where there's a transverse ligament destruction due to tuberculosis infection. And stage 3 is where the structural damage to bone around the atlantodental joint, and these present with atlantoaxial instability, hence requiring atlantoaxial fusion. Here is one case where predominantly involving the atlantoaxial joint and presenting with instability. It was managed by posterior stabilization, fusing the C1 and C2 alone, and ended up with good result. Now, in stage 3, if there is a structural damage to the lateral ataxial joints, there may be vertical translocation of the dens, and this might require an atlantoaxial occipital fusion. Here is one case where you can see there's a basilar invagination because of the destruction of the lateral muscle, but here we were able to manage it with the C1 C2 fusion alone with good results. That's the result here. Now, in fact, it had gone in for it. As you can see, it's finally gone for a fusion there. Now, coming to the strategies in the management of these lesions. Before surgery, the feasibility of the screw placement in the axial pedicle and the extent of damage caused by the tuberculosis to the lateral masses of the atlas and the pedicle of axis should be assessed in detailed radiological investigation, because you should just ascertain whether you can place screws in these areas. Minimizing the loss of the cervical spine mobility is an important principle in choosing the fusion method, and preferably short segment fixation fusion should be used. Supposing with the intact lateral masses of the atlas as well as the pedicle of the axis, you can go in for a C1 C2 fixation. But whereas if there is a tuberculous destruction of the atlas, lateral masses, and the axial vertebral body, you will have to go in for occipital cervical fusion combined with superficial bone grafting. Now, there are anterior surgeries which have been sometimes may be indicated, but they have their demerits in the form of lack of reliable anterior internal fixation material as well as difficult to achieve fusion even in spite of putting a lot of bone graft. The various anterior surgical approaches are the transoral approach, lateral upper cervical approach, the anterior retrofrontal approach, and the traditional anterior cervical approach. Now, I'm not going to details about each one of them. This is the traditional transoral approach, which is not very familiar nowadays. And other methods are the retrofrontal approach, the submandibular approach. You can expose on either sides, like what we have done here in one case. We were able to approach it anteriorly and even do a C1 C2 fusion anteriorly. And the traditional anterior cervical approach, but here the approach may be very difficult and the risk of incomplete clearance of the foci may be there. Now, continuing the strategy, a single posterior surgery can well reconstruct the stability of the upper cervical spine in most cases. Most of the time, you can just do away with posterior surgery alone. But combined anterior and posterior surgery may be indicated when there is a presence of neurological damage in atlantoaxial tuberculosis. Now, coming to the cervicodorsal junction tuberculosis, other next type, which is incidence of around 5%. Here again, the complexity of the cervicothoracic junction has to be noted, and hence specialized anatomical knowledge and expert surgical skills are required for surgeons in management of these disorders. The surgical options available are: one is the anterior approach alone. It is limited for purely cervicothoracic junction tuberculosis. Combined anterior posterior approach for extensive tuberculous lesions of the junction involving more of the thoracic segments, and posterior only approach if it's predominantly involving the thoracic segment, just involving probably the last cervical vertebrae. Now, the anterior approach, the approach selection method is based upon the cervicothoracic angle. What is the cervicothoracic angle? It is, as you can see in the diagram here, it is a triangle drawn among 3 points. One is from the point, one is in the supraspinal notch, other one is the midpoint of the anterior border of the C7 T1 intervertebral disc, and then the third point is the corresponding anterior border corresponding to the supraspinal notch. So this can be like, if type A is where it is going to be above the CTA, when you can just go in for anterior low supraspinal approach alone. Type B is where it is going to be within the triangle. Then you might have to go in for a anterior low supraspinal notch along with the manubriotomy or sternotomy. Type C is where it's going to be below. It's going to be below the triangle, when you might have to again go in for a sternotomy or a clavicle dissecting approach, or sometimes you might have to go in for a transpedicular approach posteriorly. So this is like, for example, this is one which is inside the triangle, where you can manage it with the low sternal approach as well as by like sternal splitting approach. So purely if it's going to be in the cervicothoracic junction, you can just go away with the anterior only approach alone, as in this case. Combined anterior posterior approach can maybe indicate a situation like this here, where you can see there's involvement of the junction there, it falls within the triangle CTA, and this lady presenting with the power of 4/5. And here we had approached this region by the clavicle resecting approach. And the stage 1 was an anteriorly. After reconstruction, we went in for a posterior stabilization to stabilize. Since we had, in fact, the radiology was not, it was quite deceptive, and we found that the lesion was extensive, and then we had to go in for a posterior stabilization. Now, coming to the lumbosacral junction tuberculosis, the incidence is around 10 to 15%. The surgical treatment of advanced lumbosacral tuberculosis remains difficult and controversial, and a few detailed studies on surgical strategies in lumbosacral junction tuberculosis has been explained. There's no universal adopted surgical strategy to reconstruct the lumbosacral junction, and there's no defined guidelines on specific fixation techniques to reconstruct the lumbosacral spine. Now, the uniqueness of the lumbosacral spine is that the lordotic lumbar spine is placed over the kyphotic sacrum, and the unique lumbosacral anatomy and the biomechanics all have a peculiar pattern of disease progression and development of deformity. You will not be able to predict how it is going to proceed. Like, for example, here you can see the total collapse of L5, but the alignment is maintained, whereas here the second case where you can extensive disease involvement with the collapse of the L5 vertebrae, and then the spinal alignment is maintained, whereas here, even with the collapse, you can see there's an ambulation there. So, based upon the pathology it's going to present, in early lumbosacral tuberculosis with a lesser vertebral destruction, there may be minimal loss of lordosis alone. Whereas in advanced lumbosacral tuberculosis, the extensive destruction, there may be hyperlordosis or kyphosis with instability, leading on to loss of the normal lumbosacral biomechanics, presenting with back pain and poor functional outcomes. Now, surgery remains the mainstay of treatment in advanced lumbosacral tuberculosis, mainly required for reconstruction and restoration of stability of the lumbosacral junction, restore the physiological lumbar lordosis lumbosacral angle, and to restore the global spine stability and maintain the spinal stability until the bone heals. Now, just by performing the anterior debridement alone, it presented with a high incidence of graft-related problems. Hence, it was supported with the posterior instrumentation, which augments the posterior spinal stability and helps in withstanding the shear force across the lumbosacral junction, prevents graft-related complications. Now, the posterior instrumentation of the lumbosacral region is technically demanding due to the complex region anatomy, the unique biomechanics, and the fixation difficulty in diseased bone, and loss of sacral bone for implant anchorage, and high chance of failure due to shear stresses. Hence, a spinopelvic fixation is an effective surgical option in these situations. The spinopelvic fixation lumbosacral tuberculosis may be indicated in case of long fusion to sacrum for extensive destruction lumbosacral junction, and when there is a loss of sacral bone for implant anchorage. Two biomechanical aspects which has to be considered in these lesions are one is the lumbosacral pivot point of McCord et al. This is a point at the middle osteoligamentous column between the last lumbar vertebrae and the sacrum. That is the McCord point here, as you can see here. So what does it indicate? The further that the implants extend anterior to this point, the greater the stiffness of the construct. Now, how about using a S1 screw alone? Like the failure rates of using just S1 screws alone is to the extent of 44%, and the S2 pedicle screws really does not add to the stability, like because it is dorsal to the lumbosacral, the McCord point, which we have described now recently. So hence, there is a need for iliac screws in these situations. The recent described technique is the S2 alar iliac screw fixation. And this is, as you can see here, this is the way we insert it through the ala into the ilium. And this has got lesser soft tissue dissection, and it's biomechanically quite similar to that of using iliac screws, and with good short-term outcomes. And we have come out with the proposed classification in the management of these lumbosacral tuberculosis. Like we have divided to type 1, where it's going to involve the L4 or L5 tuberculous spondylosis, where you can just do a posterior stabilization with 4 anchors proximal and 4 anchors distally, as you can see it here. This is one example of a type 1 type lesion. Now, type 2 is where there's a complete destruction of the L5 vertebrae, as you can see it here, when you can do away with the levels, 4 proximal anchors in L3 and L4, and then distal anchors in S1 alone. If the S1 is inadequate because of disease process, you might have to go in for an iliac screw. So this is what we've done here now. So you can, it was not quite adequate. The S1 is not quite adequate because of disease process there. So we had to go in for an iliac screw also. Now, supposing the sacral ala is the place where you get the anchorage as far as S1 is concerned. So in type 3, this is destroyed here. In such situations, what is the option now? You can see that the ala is intact here, and then you can do away with an alar screw here along with the iliac screws here. So this is what has been done here. This is a lesion where you can see the destruction of the promontory area here. And here you have used the alar screws here now. And supposing the destruction of ala also, then what is the option now? So you will have to go to just do away with the iliac screw alone here. And this is what has been done here. This is a type 4 here now. This is type 4. So in the presence of significant vertebral height loss or anterior column deficiency, and if you need to restore the lordosis, then you will have to go in for, like for example, in this case, there's the extensive destruction there. You can see from L1 to S1, you can see the amount of destruction here. So we went in for a posterior stabilization, followed, and you can see the alar screws here now. And then we had gone in for a reconstruction with the anterior column with the fibula graft there. So in the deficiency of the anterior column, you definitely will have to reconstruct the anterior column by bone, either cage or a bone graft here. So you can see at 8 years follow-up, you can see the amount of restoration of the fibular graft there, hypertrophy of the fibular graft being there. So the proposed classification is effective in addressing the various scenarios of lumbosacral tuberculosis, and it helps reconstruct the lumbosacral spine and restore stability, and it helps in restoring the physiological lumbar lordosis. And I cannot conclude without talking about the medical management. Whatever said and done, medical management is very important. Whatever the site or the stage of disease, anti-tuberculous chemotherapy plays an important role in the management of spinal tuberculosis, and the anti-TB chemotherapy and improved nutrition have resulted in excellent functional outcomes in patients who present early without deformity and neurologic deficit and kyphoid deformity and spinal instability. And the availability of potent anti-tuberculous drugs have made uncomplicated tuberculosis a medical disease. So hence, to conclude, the individualized surgical strategy should be formulated according to the type and characteristics of junction tuberculosis. A detailed radiological evaluation of pathology is mandatory in the management of junction tuberculosis, especially pan-vertebral disease and those affecting the anterior column over more than one vertebrae. And a good pre-operative planning taking into consideration pathology and biomechanics is a must. Thank you.
Excellent, sir. Excellent talk. Excellent cases.
Yeah.
I have one question, sir, for you.
Yeah.
So how long the TB drugs you will give, and what is the end point for your medical treatment, sir?
Yeah.
Surgery without surgery.
I think this is a very important question. No, like almost every like teaching program, no, we just come across this question. But I see this the duration of ATT being put by the various surgeons. We see that it's varying. There is no uniformity. So what we follow is we start them on ATT. In fact, we refer them to the chest clinic, and they start the ATT, and we normally carry it on up to 9 months. So by the 6th month onward, we start monitoring them. Like we do the inflammatory markers as well as the X-ray and MRI. We do not do much actually. So we just monitor them, and by the 9th month, we started trying to find an option to stop the anti-tuberculous drugs. But most often we say that we will have to extend the TB drugs for 11 to 12 months. That's what we see now. Suppose the disease load is lesser, like for example, just going to be a pan-vertebral disease alone, then we are able to stop it by 9 months. Whereas otherwise, we will have to go in for most of the time, it will be 11 to 12 months. And sometimes we have extended up to 2 or 3 months beyond that. So we just monitor with the inflammatory markers as well as the radiology also. I think we can invite the opinion of our seniors here. You can see like Rajamani can enlighten us on what does he do, what's the opinion about the duration of anti-tuberculous therapy. And Yuvraj can also give a comment about it.
Sir, I actually want to ask you a question, sir.
Yeah.
So yes, sir. So based on the
can you finish the ATT part, the duration?
Yes, sir. Based on the ATT only, sir.
Yeah.
I think the recent TB national program guidelines have changed from 2017, and they are giving patients. There's only one regimen for all newly diagnosed TB patients based on either pulmonary extrapulmonary, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it is a weight-based program. So I see that some patients who are obese, they receive even 5 tablets, 6 tablets per day. And what I've seen is most of these people come back with hepatitis symptoms. They have a lot of altered liver enzymes. That is something that's commonly I've seen in the past 1 or 2 years where I'm practicing. So what is your experience on this, and how do you tackle this when that happens? Because I think it's a usual practical problem after this weight-based treatment. The people are getting five tablets, 6 tablets of AKT4 every day.
Yeah. See now, regarding this, that is the reason. No, like I would advise our orthopedic surgeons to don't take up this drug therapy of tuberculosis. We leave it to the chest physician. I think who does it, who prescribes the drugs based upon the weight. I think weight of the individual very, very important. It is not just AKT for even for a lean individual and then for obese individual also the same AKT4. It is not like that. It depends upon you are going to prescribe the drug based upon the weight of the patient. I think that has to be very, very important. That's the reason why if you are able to do that, you do that. Otherwise, no, you leave it to the physician, the chest physician who's able to manage it very well. Second thing is, in the case of you say the enzymes, liver enzymes getting increased. So I think there is you need not panic as such. It depends upon the extent of the raise of the hepatic enzymes. If it is going to be 3 times the value, that's what they guide us. I've been discussing with the physicians. If you have a 3 times the level of the normal level, if it is raised there, then you got to stop it. And what they normally do is they they give a holiday period, like you just hold on these drugs, and then you start drugs one by one. One by one, they keep starting it, and just they monitor the liver enzymes. Supposing if it's going to be just a mild elevation of the liver enzymes, what they say is you can just still continue with the ATT drugs. So you need not to panic about it. Supposing it's going to be 3 times the rise, very high rise, then you got to stop all the ATT drugs and then start introducing one by one. That's what they advise.
Okay. So, and regarding the ATT duration, so that we discussed, so what I learned from CNC Vellore, our protocol is always for 9 months. So we usually don't extend it beyond 9 months. And so, like you rightly said, sir, you said you don't do MRI to make follow-up. So you only go by blood parameters and clinical improvement. So we also done a study on MRI at the end of 9 months of ATT treatment, and we found that many patients, they tend to have persistent edema, bone edema, even at the end of 9 months of ATT, but they clinically or biochemistry, they are normal. So we have just dropped ATT on these patients and we followed them up over, say, 2 years, and we repeated MRI, and we found that the MRI changes, they have resolved just by themselves without any further treatment. So this, I think it's safe to assume that MRI change persisting at the end of 9 months or say even 1 year of ATT is not necessarily indication to prolong treatment as long as the patient is clinically fine and the blood parameters are all within normal limits. So just that's what I wanted to add on.
Yeah. Okay. Ramani sir.
Yeah.
What about ATT, the duration? And
the ATT duration, it is roughly varying from 6 to 9 months, depending upon the patient's condition, the severity, and we can't go simply by weight because in our setup is totally different from what the others regimens are saying. But for example, when I was a postgraduate, I was told a just for a joke, they will tell a carry spine lady should not marry. If at all marry, should not carry. That is at least for 18 months they used to give on those days, skeletal tuberculosis. But in those regimes, if you see there is skeletal tuberculosis, there is no slot at all was there at that time. So now it has been reduced to 12 months and then now it starts with 6 to 9 months. So 6 to 9 months is a must, and depending upon the patient variation, I do agree with Nalli, because better leave the job to the physician because it has to be systematically treated. So it is better best people to judge on those lines, this chest physician. And as long as our point of view is concerned, it is best to 6 to 9 months, depending upon the case.
Just another point on this, sir. The actual government, I would say the government directives on ATT today is for all newly diagnosed tuberculosis, pulmonary, extrapulmonary, everything. They only recommend 6 months of treatment. So that's the government national program directive. There is no 9 months or 18 months. There is no
minimum 6 months.
6 months is the government directive, sir. So
it's the government.
I think most of us would think that is not adequate, even for spine TB or any other muscle-specific TB. So this is something that I think the senior professors like you could take it up with the appropriate people. I don't know whether it is correct to universally apply this standard for all patients.
That's what I told you. You cannot apply standard universal because it has to be individual variation and regional variation is there. Still, I feel, my personal feeling is you have to assess the patient clinically, biochemically, radiologically, and depending upon the progress, you have to decide how long. But minimum 6 months up to 9 months.
So
Safe,
I have had a lot of discussions with the chest physicians regarding this duration. Like they say that two conditions. One is the positive bacillary types. One is the bone and joint tuberculosis and CNS tuberculosis. These are the two conditions which require more than 6 months of waiting. That's what they say.
Minimum 6 months up to maximum 9 months.
Regarding biopsies,
Yeah.
Biopsies, how about?
That is a very, very good question because like I see nowadays, a lot of people going for empirical ATT.
Yes.
Okay, there is no role for empirical treatment at all. You will have to, because you will have to confirm it with the tissue diagnosis and only then start ATT. You cannot, because now you have a lot of litigations coming up now. I will just tell one in short, like there is one young lady who came to me, she returned from Muscat 3 years back, and she was on a holiday, and she came with a pain in the, just developed a mild pain in the back, and she came to dorsal-lumbar region. And the features were typical of tuberculosis, I tell you. I suggested her a biopsy. Then I did a biopsy. And then when she came with the result was the secondaries.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. See, what would have happened if I had started this lady on ATT? The picture was just typical of ATT, tuberculosis. If only I had started on ATT, it would have been real miss then. I had been continuing with ATT for 3 or 6 months, and then she returns with a really bad situation. Then we are in for trouble now. So that's the reason why don't go for empirical ATT at all. Now, what happens? Suppose you do a biopsy and then you don't get a result. That happens also. In a small percentage of cases, we do a biopsy, we don't get a result at all. And that situation, if you feel that it is more towards tuberculosis, you can just start. Of course, you are supposed to repeat the biopsy, but they might not be willing for it, patients in the private sector. In such situations, you are justified because you can just say that I made an attempt to make a diagnosis, I was not able to make it. I attempted to make a tissue diagnosis, I was not able to make it. In such situations, you are justified in starting ATT. That's
it. Anything, Dr. Ramachandran, you want to?
Actually, it's not just alone for diagnosis, and nowadays the chances of resistance, multi-drug resistance, it's not just a patient who is being given TB drugs, then it is becoming, even a primary resistance is also recorded, and say it's about 2 to 6% of the cases of primary resistance. And the percentage increases still more to 12%. So biopsy is mandatory, one for confirmation of diagnosis. As indicated, there was one malignancy, just to confirm. I had one experience with myeloma. So one for confirmation, another is for resistance. Resistance has to be detected. Might treat, but still the patient is not responding. It might be TB also. So resistance has to be detected. That is based on biopsy. So even if it is going to be CVJ TB, even if it is not an easy accessible, just put a needle, as Dr. Nalli sir has clearly pointed out, just put a transoral needle, aspirate the pus, biopsy, whatever it is, and you get a good tissue. But yeah, there will be an option always. Even after doing a good tissue biopsy, you might end up in having a negative biopsy, but it should be recorded at least for medical legal reasons. And with respect to Melissa, just to add up one point with respect to cervicothoracic junction TB, they have shown one perfect picture of a CTA angle where the manubrium showing us the view whether we can go access. So just to add up, since I was trained with neurosurgeon Dr. Satish, he used to do surgery with microscope where the tilting of the microscopes will help us beyond that CTA angle. Only limitation factor for reaching the lowermost T3 T4 is the brachiocephalic vein that comes in the view, that can obscure the view. So despite of the angles we can reach, but plating and those things might be a difficulty. Yeah, but definitely debridement can be done if a microscope is used. Yeah. And your vision can be improved. That's the limiting factor, and I feel sternum is not the limiting factor most of the times. It's a brachiocephalic vein that limits.
Yes. Okay.
Natarajan sir.
Yes, sir. Dr. Professor Neelakesh,
Krishnan, sir.
you can introduce our eminent speaker, Dr. Rajamani, sir, to talk on.
Rajamani. Yeah, osteoporotic, management osteoporotic complex course. Rajamani needs no introduction. He is the emeritus professor of the TN Dr. MJ Medical University. He is an endoscopic and Miss spine surgeon, practices at Preetham Spine Center, Madurai. He is a former professor of orthopedic surgery at Madurai Medical College and former orthopedic and spine surgeon at Government Rajaji Hospital, Madurai. Qualifications: he did MBBS in 1976 at Madurai Medical College. Again, he also at Madurai Medical College in 1980. Again, Madurai Medical College, he finished MS also in 1982. And he has been the university rank holder in MBBS, university rank holder in DRSO, university rank holder in MS also. Madurai Medical College, all times university rank holder. He has been done fellowship in spine surgery in 1989 at Germany, 1990 Swiss, and 1992 UK. He has a great academic teaching experience. He has been an undergraduate and postgraduate teacher for 30 years, undergraduate examiner for 25 years, and he has been a regular examiner in all the universities for 20 years. He guided more than postgraduates on thesis, and he has been a PG examiner for 25 years. And professional surgical experience, he has done more than 10,000 spine surgeries till date, and he has injuries with his specialist injuries and quadriplegia and paraplegia more than 2,000 cases, deformity correction more than 1,000 cases, disc plaques and infections 2,500, endoscopic and spine surgeries more than 2,000. He has presented more than 250 scientific papers in state, national, and international conferences. Won the best paper gold medal 5 times in state, national, and international conferences. Published 22 papers in state, national, and international journals. He has received the Best Teacher Award from Tamil Nadu Dr. MJ Medical University in 2011. Best Doctor Surgeon Award and from Tamil Nadu Dr. MJ Medical University in 2012. He has been the past secretary of TNYA, was the past president of TNYA and past president of YSS and vice president of Indian Orthopedic Association. Presently, he is a chairman, undergraduate and postgraduate training committee of the Indian Orthopedic Association. Orations: he has given 10 orations, given the state and national and international conferences, and today he is with us to speak on management of osteoporotic compression fractures. Over to you, sir.
Good evening to you all. Thank Professor Neelakesh for the nice words. And this good evening, I welcome all the delegates, friends, the COS President, Professor Neela, and COS Secretary, Dr. Natarajan, and members of academic bodies. I'm going to talk on management of osteoporotic compression fracture. Really, it is very difficult to talk A to Z of an osteoporosis, which day to day everyone come across in their day-to-day practice. So I'll touch upon certain salient features in my lecture. I think all of us know that osteoporosis is a systemic disease. And apart from that, you must remember it is a silently progressive disease, not like unless other disease. It is a silently progressive disease. And it produces, why it produces a fragile fracture, the so-called compression fractures, as many times called as a fragile fracture, because osteoporosis, because of the systemic problem, leads to bone mineral loss with the concurrent bony action changes, leading to a compression fracture, either with a minor trauma or no trauma at all. That is very, very classical. And most of the osteoporotic spine fractures present you with a picture like this. When you take an X-ray for some other purpose, you may accidentally find out this is there. If you ask the patient whether you had a fall, they'll say no. So most of the times it is asymptomatic, and sometimes the same picture patient will come with pain, and sometimes patient come with gross kyphotic deformity, especially old individuals, and very occasionally patient will have a neurological deficit and then come to you. Usually this starts with a single vertebra like this and goes on to have a multiple vertebra for the same patient, because once a single vertebra is involved, further fracture occur by virtue of force transmission to a weak vertebra, both proximally and distally, need not have any trauma. Normal day-to-day activities itself can produce multiple fracture, and especially when it is the old age group, especially when the dorsal spine involved, the cardiopulmonary space is less, and patient will have, if the comorbidity is there, even it can lead on to mortality by 25%. Of course, obviously, everybody knows diagnosis, the laboratory investigations. I need not elaborate, starting from serum calcium phosphorus, alkaline phosphatase, and proteins. Mainstay is the radiology. You know, day-to-day practice, DIXA and digital X-ray is what commonly done. But apart from this, there is a possibility of a quantitative CT, quantitative ultrasound, and the role of MRI. The role of MRI, which I will come to on subsequently, and EOS, there is a 2D picture of a digital image, is nothing but EOS. And how about, there are some markers, osteoporotic markers, many types of markers are there, but mainly the bone turnover markers are C-terminal polypeptide and microRNA. These things are not routinely done, but these things will be useful while to not only diagnosis, but also the response to your treatment. And these are all the two things are very specific markers. Coming to the treatment of the osteoporotic fractures, non-surgical treatment for a painful osteovertebral fractures, we should not forget again, it is the local manifestation of a systemic disease. So you have to treat systematically, not only systematically, but systemically also. That is a bed rest, narcotic analgesic, bracing, anybody do it routinely. In spite of it, if the pain increases, it indicates there is something more, it is still more progressing because of the acceleration of bone loss and the muscle weakness, which is due to metabolic reasons. And so at this stage, probably you have to start on antidisruptive drugs or anabolic drugs or dual action drugs. It itself is a big debates and for and against are there. I'm not going into the detail of that. It needs for a day to discuss on those things. So now, in spite of all these conservative treatment, if the pain increases or if the deformity progresses or if the neurology occurs, probably you have the scenario like this, and then it progresses badly. It means progresses badly. So whether to establish a deformity or a neurological deficit, we have to get alert, whether can we predict whether this case responds to conservative treatment or not. Yes, we can predict. For that, you need to know certain basic types of osteoporotic vertebral fractures. This is an MRI. Based on this, you have to differentiate what part of the vertebra is involved. Either it is anatomical, whether it is central or anterior or inferior, or superior part or total or posterior. This one is a must to know or protect or to predict whether the particular case is going to respond to you well or going to prognose badly. One another investigation is a CT examination. By CT, you can assess the morphological disease. That is, whether it is swollen front like this or a bow type, that there is a both ends or bowing type, and then projecting type, a concave type, and a dentate type. If you analyze these two with an MRI and a CT, you can predict whether this case is going to stop with a single vertebra following your conservative treatment, or it is going to progress further. Usually on CT, a picture like this, a swollen vertebra in the front, or a projecting type like this, or a bow type. When you have a picture like this in a CT, it is going to have a poor prognosis because late collapse and the deformity is going to be there. And CT-wise, these three types are very bad. You have to be very cautious. These are all red flags on this side. Then coming to the MRI, the central type, the anterior type, and the inferior type by CT. This is going to have a poor prognosis because when compared to all the other three in the upper part of the row, the lower part of the diagrams where there is spine is involved, these cases are going to have a further collapse and further progression of the fracture proximally above and below, leads to a poor prognosis. So in a nutshell, to say how to predict the worsening or failure or progress of the disease or the deformity, once again, of late, a MRI T2 image is more useful. Something like you have a hyperintense shadow in the superior half, or there is a total diffuse low intensity within this vertebra. When these two signs are there in osteoporotic fracture, once again, apart from what you see by other swollen front or bow type or projecting type, these two types are also going to progress. In those cases, do not wait. you try to rectify by so many other surgical or minimally invasive access. So now the surgical indications in these types of cases, like either it is a painful or going to produce an unstable scenario, or with the neurology, surgical treatment is indicated in osteoporosis. Now coming to what type of stabilization, you see, when I was a young surgeon, as a postgraduate, we used to do it like this. Not because the main reason is posterior column is stronger than the anterior in these types of osteoporosis. So we used to have a long contraction, those time-tested methods on those days with a sublaminar wire with the Luggi rods. That was we started our career in those days. And subsequently, as the technology improved, we started doing the hooks and then the rods with the sublaminar wire, what we call it as a hybrid fixation. And further, when the pedicle screw came, we combined and permutations of all these things depending upon the economy of the patient, depending upon your expertise. But one thing is common, we need to have a longer segments of the stabilization. So whatever you use, whether a hybrid fixation or a pedicular stabilization on these individuals, a segmental, multi-segmental fixation has to be done because the isolated screw load is reduced and the screw, the concept, whole concept becomes rigid and more stiff. It serves the purpose. So the problem of the question of whether I use a pedicle screws or the hooks, the principle of long construct is always not changed. Then the concept now what we thought of, not only the posterior, stabilizing the anterior or making the anterior which is weak, you make it anterior. Once again, this problem will get solved. That is by cementing. That what you see is the injection of the cement into the vertebrae from the posterior approach. Everything was done posteriorly. When you stabilize or make anterior also stronger, probably you can reduce the segments from multi-level, you can reduce the 2 segments above or 2 segments below. Of course, all it depends on what is the status of the both Silmore proximal or distal, Silmore distal vertebrae. Whatever you do, because it is systemically progressive disease, heart will fail either immediate post-op or early. Because of the it all depends on the pull-out strength of the pedicle screw. Quite often you have a hardware failure in these types of cases. So the optimizing pedicle screw is very important to concentrate on the bone implant interface by injectable cement. So, but the problem with the cement is, the cement leakage, which is very potential problem. Patient, whether it's superior, inferior, anterior, no problem. But when the cement leaks posterior, really you are in trouble, you are worsening, it induces paraplegia. So, biodegradable cement and biocompatible cements are available now coming into the market, very soon freely available. So those things do not produce heat. Even if you go into the posterior side, probably you may not have much a problem of a leakage and inducing paraparesis. So another advancement has come, changing the screw design, designing conically, or it's an expandable screw like this, and you can go a screw with or after cement injection. These are all the things we try to avoid by pulling out of the screw, by increasing the strength of the pull-out screw so that you not have a technical problem. And this one I do is the fenestrated screw, a cannulated screw with the holes there, so we can inject the screw, put in the screw, and then we can inject the cement both whatever weak vertebra is there. And this type of expandable screw, this side of pattern, which I don't have experience, but I have got an experience where the tip gets widened. That is freely available, and that is also economical for the patient. Then still the problem was not solved. So now we try to do changing the trajectory, what we use for a regular pedicular screw insertion, and then the screw orientation and the screw triangulation is totally altered. Something like this, we start more laterally because the pedicle cortex is more lateral. So we bought more lateral and then converging screw where we try to touch up the screw in the anterior side. Or one version is you thought more lateral and then go to the lateral cortex. But of course, you must be very careful. You should not break it and then the right side and left side, the vasculature should not be injured. You must be very careful on when you use these types of trajectory. And already the deformity case is there, you must be doubly cautious. And another way we change the trajectory is you change the screw from inferior to superior so that it goes to the superior end plate. So these are all the gimmicks we have trying or techniques we are trying to increase the strength of the pedicular screw fixation, and which you can do with an MRI. Now, what is the role of, as a minimally invasive surgeon, what is the role of minimally invasive surgery in this osteoporotic compression fracture? It all depends whether you got a single or multiple in the same case. Vertebroplasty and kyphoplasty, you know, that's what we do like this. The indications varies. Vertebroplasty in acute cases, and then the kyphoplasty in chronic cases where the bone gets collapsed, you distend it, you create a cavity there, and then you inject the cement. That is the basic difference between the vertebroplasty and kyphoplasty. And of course, there are so many names are there: stentoplasty, vesselplasty, radiofrequency kyphoplasty, lordoplasty, spine jack. These are all just a play of words of what we use. You have a sac there, a metal sac, you dilate it and then you inject, or you can do a radiofrequency kyphoplasty, or you can have a spinal jack. All these things are available, but I don't have much experience with spinal jack, but I have a vertebroplasty or kyphoplasty, and 1 or 2 cases of vesselplasties are done, because this vesselplasty is very costly an affair for the implant itself. But whatever you do, whether kyphoplasty or vertebroplasty, selection and execution is very, very important. You have to choose the case, the right cases, because the cement leakage is a very, 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 very important, very potential complication, the challenging complications. So selection of the case is very, very important. The execution is still more important. This is just a few examples what I have done is for single level vertebroplasty. And the challenging, as I told you earlier, cement leakage. And this is more than 1 or 2 level adjoining vertebral level. We have done a cement injection. And then, as I told you, nowadays, calcium phosphate and calcium sulfate cement are available, which are the biodegradable and biocompatible. And of course, we have to wait for 3 to 6 months. And now, off late, it has come out with the hydroxyapatite coated screw fixation is now coming into the market, but of course, in a costly affair. And of course, CTG also will be coming into the market, but both are very costly an affair. And this is what I told you, vesselplasty or expandable basket. It is available in our market today by Daewoo company, but of course, a very inexpensive. Ordinary patient we cannot use, and that too when you want to do 3 or 4 level, it's very expensive. What you do is nothing but a kyphoplasty, where you open up the balloon and then take it away, create a cavity, and then they inject the cement. But in this type, we put in there the cage and then we make it, basket, we make it expand, and then within that we inject the cement. That is the difference between all these things. Only a play of words, and basically everything is to inject the cement into the vertebra. Whether you dilate and then take it a temporary dilator or a permanent dilator, something like a basket, which avoid collapsing of that. Then coming to 1 or 2 case example, suppose this is an acute one where this short segment. If you notice carefully, with the original conventional method, we use long segment. And then next step is when we make anterior column stronger, we had a 2 segment proximal to distal. Now, the more and more we do minimally invasive spine surgery, we use more percutaneous screws, percutaneous rods, and then we inject the cement. As I told you, the problem in this is open. So every possibility of injecting a cement in this lesion is it will come into the spinal canal straight away. For that, what we use is an egg-shelling technique. What we use is to inject the cement with a variable intensity of salt. First, we inject at this level, you wait without much pressure, you inject the cement here. Once that consolidate, then we take another syringe, put on a cement further into the anterior. So directly, we don't inject directly because there is a very possibility of slipping of the leakage of the cement. So we block this. This is called a egg-shelling technique. But in this one, the more and more minimally invasive surgery has come. They have reduced the segment with the cement augmented screws. That is very essential. Instead of having a long segment, we have a shorter segment by minimally invasive surgeries. And this is another example where we have a vertebral and then we have injected the cement into the hole, all the 3 segments. This is the incision of the scar which we use. So the more and more minimally invasive surgery which do more and more, the segments may be lessened. and long segments need not be done. That is the advantage of doing minimally invasive surgery in these types of osteoporotic fractures. I think with this, the surgical indications, once again, the neurological deficit may be due to acute kyphosis or retrobulbar of the fragments, not quite common in a regular osteoporotic compression fracture, and like regular traumatic fractures and spinal instability. And sagittal and coronal imbalance, it is very important. You can't correct the orthopedic instrument, you can't rotate, derotate. All these things are not possible here because if you're already in osteoporotic, you will fail and miserably, all the screws will come out. So do not try to correct these things by rotating the rods, what technique which you use in the scoliosis. You should not forget. And once again, multiple fractures, you can foresee, you can predict by all the signs or classifications which I told earlier in my lecture, by either by CT or MR or hypertension shadow. And failure conservative treatment can be predicted earlier so that you avoid much collapse and then much deformity and then later. So we can predict and then do something like bail. You can do it earlier. So whenever you think of an osteoporotic compression fracture, please remember you are dealing with the local manifestation of a systemic disease. You have to treat systematically and system-wise. Because it involves a kidney, liver, GIT, all these things, no. So it is only a local, something like a tuberculosis. It has to be systematically treated. So it is a local manifestation of systemic disease. So medical management is the key in this type of fracture. This definitely selection and the execution and the case and the very precaution is very, very essential to have a success. And the long segment fixation is ideal when you do a very conventional surgeries like posterior surgeries, which a long segment is involved. And you have got an options, a percutaneous screws with the segment augmentation is available. And one more, the last and not least, of course, all of us, mostly all of us are above 40. We don't have an opportunity of prevention of the osteoporosis. Probably this could have been done in the younger age group. Something like if you put in the bank balance earlier, you can withdraw. Same way, even in the adolescent age group, you can make the concept of, at least for our grandchildren or our children, to have a physical activity, see that your bone stock is very well maintained in the younger age group, so that you need to maintain in the old age group so that osteoporosis do not occur. And as long as old age group is concerned, prevention is better. Always make all the precaution steps not to fall. Taking a full bathroom tiles and chapels and all those things definitely have a role in prevention is better than cure. I think this much. I stop with this because it is not possible to cover. It is an entire bigger topic we can't cover in 15 minutes. And I once again thank the organizer, the COS, particularly all the members of COS, the President Neela, the Secretary Natarajan, and all the delegates, and the company. We made us all these technical help in organizing these webinars. I thank once again. Thank you so much, one and all. Thank you.
Excellent talk, sir. Excellent talk. So, sir, I have a few questions, sir.
Yeah.
So what are the indications for a vertebroplasty or a kyphoplasty for per se?
Once again, vertebroplasty and kyphoplasty, as I told you, it is a play of words. An acute, which just you don't try to distend, you just vertebroplasty can be done in acute precaution. Kyphoplasty, you try to correct the kyphosis to a certain extent because you are opening of the vertebra one. And then for pain relief, you can do kyphoplasty or vertebroplasty because there are so many mechanisms which I put in the slide, but I have not elaborated for want of time. It is a thermal factor, support for the vertebra, and then even the nerve endings. So for a pain relief, you can do vertebroplasty or kyphoplasty. Of course, there is definitely a role. But there is a multiple involvement. Definitely, instead of putting in an implants, the patient, all these patients are old age group with the comorbid conditions, may not be able to try long time surgery. In those cases, a multiple level kyphoplasty alone without instruments may be done. Of course, you have to choose the case.
Exactly. Superb, sir. So just to add up to the indications, so sir has told exactly about the anatomy and the morphology of the fracture based on X-ray, CT and MRI. So I would indicate in the form of two ways. Presume the patient has presented to you with a fracture, not responding to medical treatment, despite of whatever morphology, whatever it is, the patient has pain that is correlating with your fracture edema and instability. That's one indication. In sense, failed conservative therapy after 6 weeks. So another indication which I always find is, even if the patient presents to you to your OPD walking, fresh fracture, just fall, slip and fall in the bathroom, what I used to do is just take one sitting and supine X-ray. So if the sitting X-ray shows there is a worsening, which means the physiological stress itself produces worsening of the bone by increasing in the kyphosis by say 5 degree and increase in wedge angle by 8 degree and decrease in the vertebral height, then the patient will have a chance that it will worsen towards much more collapse and he will present as a late kyphotic deformity and neurological deficit. So that's one more indication. So most of the times we feel that it is more than 6 weeks only indication for vertebroplasty. No, it's even less than 6 weeks. With these dynamic X-rays, it definitely helps in predicting which condition can progress to a significant kyphosis, where major heroic surgeries like putting pedicle screws, opening out with kyphoplasty, or sometimes you have to resect it, reconstruct with bones, cages can be avoided. So that's one more point which I want to add. Mali sir, anything add up? Unmute yourself, sir. Please unmute yourself.
No, sir, you're on mute, sir.
Yeah.
There was one question on what will you do, like whether a vertebroplasty, kyphoplasty. I am in favor of a vertebroplasty. I've done only vertebroplasty. I do not do a kyphoplasty. And I've also had an opportunity to prepare, I think, for the last TNOA conference on comparing the vertebroplasty and kyphoplasty. And then I had extensively gone into literature. In fact, I have a nice presentation on that also. And the literature as such, when we go extensively, it says that it is in favor of kyphoplasty. That or I would say. It's my view. Like each one has their own views. It's my view.
But yeah, sir, I agree with that.
I feel it is a safer. The basic principle is this is for the young surgeons. The kyphoplasty is you try to increase the height. In vertebroplasty, we don't try to increase the height because whatever space is available, you inject and come out. Kyphoplasty, you make a space wider, trying to increase the height and then inject. That is one. In role of, as I told you earlier, injecting cement, whether with kyphoplasty or continue to have a pain, definitely a vertebroplasty do have a pain relief. As I told you, there are 4 or 5 mechanisms for a pain relief is there following an injection. So, but acute cases, acute fractures, if you want to do vertebroplasty, ascertain the posterior vertebral border is intact, and then definitely vertebroplasty give a very good pain relief. But you have to be very cautious. That's why I said selection of a case and execution is very, very important. You should not burn your fingers. Take a CT, analyze whatever the posterior border is intact. If it is intact, do that. Otherwise, better keep quiet.
Sir, I have a question, sir.
Yeah.
So, sir, what is your protocol for medical management in these patients, osteoporosis, sir? Bisphosphonates, what do you start, for how long? Teriparatide, calcitonin, and all.
Once again, I say the teriparatide, once again, the adherence of the therapy is very, very important. As I told you, it is a systemic disease. It is a silently progressive disease. Patient has to take for a longer period of time. Teriparatide, I use only with the severe cases. Otherwise, I don't use teriparatide. Commonly, I use all these apart from this regular substitutive therapy. With more pain, then I go on to calcitonin therapy. And then teriparatide to the last very severe cases, because they have to take for a longer time. If you take for 1 or 2 months, then stop it. There is no point in giving the teriparatide therapy. So for a longer time, the patient compliance is there. Patient will stick on to your instructions. You can go in for a teriparatide in a severe type of osteoporosis. Otherwise, you can stop with, that's why I told you grossly anabolic drugs and then the sotic drugs. So teriparatide, I keep in my regime as the last one. All other anabolic drugs I give in the stage mild and moderate cases. That's what I do. Because it is a long term, that is very, very important.
Which bisphosphonate do you prefer, sir? For how long you usually advise them? Because that also duration is important.
Once again, each bisphosphonate has got so many complications. So you have to take the individual case merit and then decide. For that, we have to know the types of phosphonates and then what each and everyone has got a problem, and then it has to be tailor-made to the particular patient. Because grossly, we can't say that this is the biphosphonate which is good for this patient. We have to once again choose a bisphosphonate very carefully.
So, can I ask this to all panelists? I mean, what is their own protocols for osteoporosis?
Yuvraj, can I add up to that question which you asked?
Yes.
Yeah. So in our center, what we do is we discuss with the endocrinologist and we refer basically for management osteoporosis. What they follow is if the T-score is less than -2.5 and if the patient is presented with osteoporotic fractures to us, it's the usual scenario that happens. So what they do is start him on teriparatide. They used to give it for a minimum of 6 months to 2 years. And because beyond 2 years, you cannot use teriparatide. So you have given the patient. So once you end up with the 2 years of regime, we continue it with a anti-resorptive drug. We give in the form of bisphosphonates that will be continued for say 3 or 4 years. Once the T-score improves, and then we used to cut it off. In case of patients who has no fractures, then we used to continue with the bisphosphonates or calcitonin in that way, just an anti-resorptive. In cases we give a bisphosphonate and the patient has some issues, complications occurs, you cannot give it up because you cannot give it beyond 5 years. You had to give a drug holiday for almost 2 years actually. In that scenario, we give another anti-resorptive drug in the form of a denosumab. That can be given in once in 6 months. So that's what we follow with a fracture with a T-score less than -2.5. We consider it as a severe osteoporosis. And
so basically, Natarajan, yes.
Yeah.
Natarajan?
For acute fractures, this Salman calcitonin is very useful. This it comes in a nasal spray. For acute fractures, the Salman calcitonin is very useful. And for long-term therapy, teriparatide and bisphosphonates are useful. And nowadays, this denosumab, human monoclonal immunoglobulin therapy is once in 6 months, subcutaneous injections are available. But it is very costly, 20,000 rupees. They are also very useful. And apart from that, vitamin D3 and calcium supplementation and zinc, multivitamins, and they also play a vital role in these systemic disease. Right?
That has to be continued. There is no doubt. But once a severe vertebral fracture, I use teriparatide. Otherwise, I don't use teriparatide. I use either all these supplementary drugs plus bisphosphonates.
Can I add something,
Yes, sir.
Yeah. See, now, regarding the usage of calcitonin, teriparatide, and then the bisphosphonates. See, as I said, like severe osteoporosis, you got to go in for teriparatide. So what is severe? It's going to be more than less than -3.5. Okay. So in that one, even a person with the osteoporotic fracture comes under severe. So what they say is the bisphosphonates take some time to act. So there, in the case of in the presence of fracture, bisphosphonates may not be very effective. So in such situations, it is better to start them on teriparatide. So now, with the availability of denosumab also coming into the picture now, recently, now there are specific indications for teriparatide. Teriparatide is only indicated in case of very severe osteoporosis. At the same time, with the fracture. In fact, it's now boiled down to just fractures alone, the acute management of fractures alone, because denosumab has also been found to be very effective in severe osteoporosis also. So that's one thing. The role of calcitonin is more of an analgesic, and the osteoporotic correction of osteoporosis is very, very less in case of calcitonin. So I would rather say, like, let us not only for analgesic purpose, maybe you can give it. Otherwise, that's also add to cost of your treatment. And I normally avoid it, because why should we add one more drug which is not going to be very effective in the correction of osteoporosis? Number two, the third thing is the denosumab, cost of denosumab. Just work out the amount, the bisphosphonates, like for 6 months you're going to give them, work out the cost, and you can just explain to the patient there. And one more thing is the trouble of taking it weekly once, something like that. Of course, you have the yearly once therapies also there. But compared to the other bisphosphonates, the denosumab is found to be very, very effective compared to the other drugs. I think denosumab is a wonderful drug. So there are clear indications for teriparatide, mainly for patients with osteoporosis and fractures.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your valuable inputs regarding.
One small question, Rajan. It's out of the topic, sir. Sir, in this COVID pandemic, the anesthetists are worried about the giving GA, and hence last 5-6 months, even small case with this class, we have stopped because of giving GA. And use spine surgeons. How we are proceeding, how to manage, and this giving anesthesia worried about this GA and this, how we are proceeding, sir. Senior surgeons can give advice.
Can I add up, sir, for that question which you asked, Neelakrishnan, sir?
Yes.
Yes, Ram.
Probably I work in a private institute with patient scattering is a little different. I would address in that way actually. So what we do is patients who are coming with emergency, as of no spinal emergency has happened, like something like a fracture coming. So but usually what we do is we do a COVID test, RT-PCR test. Then once it comes negative, we take it into the OT. If we have been ready with the emergency scenario also, where there is a separate OT, which is specially allocated for only the COVID cases with the negative, everything is done. So where we operate under PPE, surgical cases with the respirator. The anesthetist is usually used to what they do is they intubate with the respirators, full PPE set ready. And they will, during that scenario, only the anesthetist and the one more assistant physician will be there to help them. And rest all surgeons will be outside. And after a particular period, say 20 minutes is over, then we get into the OT. And most of the times our spine surgeries are usually in the prone position. We, with a PP, we operate. And this scenario has not yet happened, but for routine cases like cervical myelopathy, worsening deficits, severe radicular pain, we have operated, but after getting a COVID test. RT-PCR.
But COVID test is
Shall I?
The COVID test is a lot of false positives, false negatives are there. Around 30 to 40% of false negatives. Because ours is a COVID hospital, we are seeing many patients, 2 times, 3 times COVID negative, but CT scan shows, and we have lost many patients also. Since we are dealing with the COVID in a lot of patients, so we are not fully reliable on COVID test.
Yes.
So in my practical experience, for a safer side, if you take negative, you try to do a regional and avoid all these aerosols. And it is always very difficult to wear a PPE for more than 45 minutes and then operate. Not only PPE, we orthopedic surgeons and spine surgeons do have an apron also. So it's very, very difficult. You can't do surgery for more than 45 minutes, number one. And number two, once again, it is a COVID negative. There are empty number of false negative cases are there. Because I talked to some of the guys of the lab and then they told, they decided depending upon the virus load, the positive and negative, it comes depending upon the virus load. If the virus load is more, the test will become positive. If the virus load is less, it may become negative. So for all practical purpose, for our sake, personal sake, take all cases of a positive, try to take all precautions, and then try to avoid longer surgeries. You can do something like conservative management, close reduction in those cases possible. And in other cases where a surgery has to be done necessarily, minimize the procedure so that probably you can do it after 2 or 3 weeks. I'm telling these things mainly for your sake. You are more important than anything else because you are not very sure, but for a CT, in a setup where you got a fracture or emergency, you can't mobilize here and there, and then the cost factor also is more. So take all cases as a positive and try to minimize the procedures, split the procedures. What is to be done initially, do it. Let them wait for 2 or 3 weeks. Probably the scenario may change, and then try to protect your subs. That's what I say. Don't purely try on negative. Because there are false negative is more. There are quite a number of asymptomatic patients are there. In the given scenario, we may not be able to mobilize the patient for CT or CT. Once again, it may become an affair for the patient economically also. So take a precaution, treat all cases as my personal opinion is take all patients are positive and do whatever precaution is possible. Minimize your surgery, minimally invasive surgery as much as possible, or try to go for a conservative management. You stage your surgery so that you have a breathing time of 2 or 3 weeks. That's what I will suggest. Because especially in Madurai, the doctors, number of cases are involved is more doctors, because a lot of surgeons started doing even in not in private institutions. They have started doing surgery in the early phases without doing a COVID. It was really a shock to me. And then over a period of 7 days, 1 week or 10 days, no problem was there. So they started doing the surgeries outside without doing COVID itself. And then totally scenario has changed. So that's the reason why I feel most of the doctor is more involved in Madurai than in any other places. So we can't totally depend on COVID, whether it is positive or negative. Take all cases positive, take all precautions, protect yourself, minimize the surgery to the lesser time possible, avoid aerosol, if possible, go in for conservative treatment.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Because
sir.
we are more important than anything else. Nobody is going to come for your rescue.
Very true.
Today, if you are there, they will come to you. Tomorrow, if you are not there, they will go to another surgeon. They will not bother about you.
Okay.
You have to protect yourself. No other go.
Ram, do you have any case presentation?
Yeah, I have. If it permits, I will show couple of cases.
Couple of cases or one case? Oh, okay, whatever.
It's
If the discussion is more, we can stop with one.
Just a,
One case, okay.
yeah,
No?
and,
Okay.
yeah. It's a small one. Yeah.
Okay, please share.
I will share the screen, sir. Yeah.
I have stopped it. I have stopped sharing.
Okay. So, one continuation of the Rajamani sir's talk actually. So this case, you can see it's an this case I'm showing it just to emphasize the importance of our dynamic X-ray. This patient came probably at the third day of the trauma, and this is the sitting X-ray and this is the supine X-ray. When we do a supine X-ray, you can see the fracture which is shown here is my. You can see the X-ray, right? My marker as
Yeah, we can see.
Yeah, you can clearly see the X-ray shows there is a fracture shown at this place 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 12. Yeah, D12 on sitting X-ray it is collapsing, and in supine you can see it looks like there is no fracture at all. So this is a patient which I am talking about, even less than 6 weeks. This patient, even with the physiological load, the patient can go for a significant collapse. At this point of time, if we do plasty, this patient is done in awake position, awake surgery, and you can see the vertebroplasty is done. So it's just an awake procedure that can avoid a major condition like this. It's just another case. If we leave that lady, she will progress to this condition. You can see it's a completely kyphosed, and in this scenario, the patient presented at the end of 3 months. She had a frontal peak with the neurological deficit she came, and then this scenario will end up in doing a major surgery like this. So what I say is, when an osteoporotic fracture caught at the right time, even before 6 weeks, identified properly which patient, as Rajamani sir told, you had to identify which condition is going to progress into kyphosis. If you identify a small MIS surgery, just injecting a cement will make enormous difference in the life of the patient, because these patients are elderly, they will be something around 70, and if you do a vertebroplasty at an earlier time, you can avoid a patient going into a mortal state as well. So if we leave them, they might even die, because I would say osteoporotic fracture might end up in grave scenarios like patient getting weakness, and you do such a big surgery, the patient might end up having a surgical related complications also. So MIS surgery has a role, and which condition we have to do can be dictated, especially with this slump sitting X-ray. We call it as a slump sitting X-ray, but the patient has to sit in a normal place with little forward flexion, so that the maximum amount of pressure will happen. So that's the one thing which I wanted to highlight in this case exam.
Any other case, Dr. Ramchandran?
I have.
Okay.
Time is.
Yeah.
We can brief if you have it 5 minutes, within 5 minutes.
Yeah, we can finish now.
Okay.
So this is with respect to junctional tuberculosis. Yeah, one junction case of this case, junctional tuberculosis, a complete course of T2, and this was operated by substernal approach without cutting any of the sternum using mentor. He did it, and he did a complete resection and then implanted with iliac grafting and operating. So the point which I wanted to highlight is use of a microscope at the cervicothoracic junction can improve your view, and the most important hindrance in reaching sub T3, T4 will be a brachiocephalic vein and not a manubrium sternum. This is the point which I wanted to highlight here. And in those scenarios where we cannot, there might be a scenario where you may not be able to plate it. This one case which was operated, it is not a TB, it is a pyogenic discitis. So we can do anteriorly, you can debride it, you can put iliac graft, and then posteriorly you can go and put pedicle screws, cervical pedicle screws with thing. So plating will be an hindrance in anterior T2 and T3 areas. In that scenario, you can go behind and then instrument it. But yeah, definitely we can do a good amount of debridement anteriorly without cutting the sternum. That's the point, sir. That's it, sir.
Good. Once again, the point is very clear. Up to T2, we can go without disturbing the sternum. Distal to that, instrumentation will be a problem. Rightly said.
Shall we close vote of thanks?
Before closing, okay, I will say, because all the young surgeons and our faculties and friends, take care, because it's very, very important. You are more important for your family first, and then to the next to the society. The people will say this, you may think that I am talking silk, but you are more important. Whatever said and done, you are important for your family. So don't try to be in a hurry in operating, because we have seen a worst scenario in Madurai. Whatever it is, postpone. Nothing is going to happen. You can operate in 1 month, but we have to be very safe. Unless you have a very supportive structures like in a corporate hospital, that too, try to be safe and stay safe and then live long. Thank you again. Over to Natarajan for saying thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your advice, sir. I thank our eminent speakers, Dr. Rajamani sir, Professor Nalini Yuvraj sir, and Dr. Yuvraj for having allotted their precious Sunday schedule to our Cholamandalam Ortho Society members, highlighting their valuable views on osteoporosis, junctional tuberculosis, and myelopathy. And I thank our co-panelists, Professor Neelakishan sir and Dr. Ramachandran, for having involved in active discussion. I thank the active participants involved in asking judicial questions. I thank Mr. Abraham Mukherjee, Regional Branch Manager, Sanofi, and their team for having sponsored this July webinar on spine. Thank you one and all. Stay safe, save lives. Thank you.
Thank you.
Over to
Thank
you.
you.
Stay safe, sir. Good night. Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Thank
Bye,
you
sir.
all.
Good night, sir.
Thank you all. Abraham Mukherjee, you want
Yes,
to
sir.
talk?
Yes, sir. So I really thanks TNOA and the Cholamandalam Ortho Society giving us opportunity to academic partner for this wonderful academic session spine. And definitely we will be there in future also, all the academic part. As all of you know, the Sanofi is always actively participate in any academic part. So we will be there. And thanks to all the eminent speakers and the panelists for your wonderful discussion and the presentation. And on behalf of Sanofi, I really thanks to all of you. And I thanks my entire team and they are continuously touch all of you, and they make it available. So today, all the attendee also to make this event successful. So on behalf of Sanofi, once again, I really thanks to all of you, and good night. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I am ending this meeting, Doctor.
Thank you.